Injuries are a harsh reality in fantasy football as in real football. Star players get hurt. Up-and-coming rookies get sidelined. The blue medical tent is the first stop on the way to a stint on injured reserve for some, and for others, it's the end of the season. They were all expected to produce, and now they're all on the bench. But they also represent opportunities for savvy dynasty managers who may be able to pick them up at a discount. We're taking a trip to the beautiful white sand beaches and crystal blue waters of the island of broken toys in this episode of Dynasty Compass. Welcome to Dynasty Compass. I am your host, Jeff Blaylock, the other Jeff B. from Football Guys, where I do Dynasty and regular season content, Dynasty rankings, and a weekly column with my colleague Josh Falsing, Dynasty Waivers of the Future, where we look into our crystal footballs and find next week's Dynasty darlings today. Thank you so much for joining me. Today we visit the island of broken toys, the place where injured players go to rest, recover, and rehabilitate. Regardless of how they got there, we're talking about productive players who are out for a prolonged period of time. That's why they are broken toys. Perhaps they are on IR, which means they're missing a minimum of 4 weeks. Maybe that IR stint is season long, or perhaps they came out of training camp on the PUP list and they're still there. Whatever their status is, they're not scoring fantasy points. They're not in lineups, and they're not helping anyone win a fantasy title, at least probably not this year. But they might return to their highly productive ways next season, possibly even by the end of this season. So there's an opportunity, if you have the patience to wait and the conviction that they'll return to somewhere near 100% of their prior production. The opportunity is there to acquire these broken toys at a discount. But we shouldn't make these kinds of moves in a vacuum. Remember, I've said before, and I will say again, the biggest mistake that dynasty managers make is they make moves without a strategy in place. Acquiring or sending away a broken toy is the kind of move that should not be made without a strategy. We need to understand if this broken toy that we're either acquiring or holding on to, how does he fit into our future plans? If we're acquiring him, can we do it without sacrificing either our present, if we are trying to contend, or our future? Or can I trade him away if I have him for enough value to make it worthwhile for me to do so? These are the kinds of questions that should be answered before you make the trade or before you move on and leave them on the shelf. Now, broken toys are a unique strategic question for dynasty managers. In redraft leagues, we simply drop them, or we never draft them in the first place. Now, if we have an IR spot in a redraft league and there is some hope of a return, then we might keep that player until that spot is needed for someone else. I'm thinking someone like quarterback Joe Burrow here. There's a possibility he could return potentially in time for the fantasy playoffs. So if I have him and I have an IR spot on my redraft team, that's probably where he is. But they're no use to us or to anyone else if they're out for the season. And since we draft all new teams every year, there's no reason for us to keep this broken toy unless there's a chance they might return by the fantasy playoffs. But in Dynasty, we do want to keep these players if we can park them on an IR spot or on a bench spot and simply wait for them to recover. Unless that injury is career ending, they'll be back next season, if not later this season. The longer time frame of Dynasty includes whatever recovery arc a player might have, even if it's more than a full season. That player is ours until we drop them or we trade them away. And when I'm thinking about someone who's out for a long, long period of time, potentially multiple seasons, I'm thinking someone like a Tank Dell, wide receiver for the Houston Texans. Now, he suffered a dislocated kneecap, a torn ACL, and damage to his MCL, his LCL, and his meniscus on a freak play while blocking near the line of scrimmage at the end of the 2024 season. He's had multiple surgeries, and he's on a long rehabilitation path. He hasn't practiced, let alone played. And in 2025, he's not expected to return at all. But he has been running sprints on the sidelines during practice, and that's an encouraging sign. There's hope he returns for the 2026 season. He's only 26 years old. And while he was nothing more than a low-end wide receiver 3 over his 2 seasons, there is potential for more than that. He was the wide receiver 12 in 2023, his rookie year, before breaking his fibula, and he ended up finishing wide receiver 39. He was the wide receiver 44 in 2024 before his knee injury, but that was nearly the entire season. So could his 2023 injury have affected him in 2024? Perhaps. That's the risk, right? That is one of the risks for trading for a broken toy, is they may not return to form, at least not at first, perhaps never, and their re-injury rates can be quite high. Football Guys' injury expert Adam Hutchison has tracked more than 2,000 injuries over the last decade or so, and has tracked outcomes and how long players tend to be out and what happens afterwards. Based on his work, I can say that quarterbacks are relatively safe bets as broken toys to return to fairly near, if not better, production later on after their injury recovery. But injuries to running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends can have very long shadows. Let me run really quickly through some of the injuries that can happen that have a high re-injury rate, plus 3 or more weeks missed on average, plus a moderate or greater performance decline, according to Adam's research. For quarterbacks, we're looking almost exclusively at shoulder injuries, including the AC joint. For running backs, we are looking at high ankle sprains. We're looking at knee injuries, such as torn ligaments and meniscus and serious sprains. We're even looking at abdominal injuries. Just below that 3-week miss threshold on average, we have hamstring and calf injuries, which may have shorter implications for missed time, but on average has much longer and more severe lingering performance effects. For wide receivers, we're looking at foot injuries. I think turf toe and ligament damage. Shoulder injuries, again, the AC joint sprain. These are players who are often up high in the air, come crashing down to the ground. If you have a shoulder injury, that's an easy way to re-aggravate that. We're also looking at core and abdominal injuries. Wide receivers, of course, have to stretch in all sorts of directions in order to catch balls flung their way. And so that's another possibility of an injury that can linger for some time. Those foot and core injuries particularly have the highest lingering effects, according to Adam. And even the hamstring, which again is a fairly short recovery arc, still has a very high re-injury rate and a potentially severe decline in performance for some time after that. When we get to tight ends, we are looking at similar injuries to wide receivers, feet, ankles, hamstrings. Again, a very high re-injury rate and severe decline if they hurt those. I'll put a link to Adam's most recent article, which as the time of this recording was before the 2025 season, in the show notes. So our expectation for a broken toy should be a somewhat lower productivity in the first year following a serious injury, or if the injury wasn't quite so serious, but in this season, lower productivity when they return. There's also a second risk that's out there that has nothing really to do with the player's own return to their full potential. It's that the person who replaced them in the starting lineup, in their role for their real football team, might have earned a permanent role in the offense because of that performance. So even if our player comes back at full health, he may now have to compete with his replacement for playing time. And so for these reasons, for the injury potential, the re-injury potential, for the lower productivity, for the chance they may get moved out of the starting lineups, for those reasons, you should not pay or expect to receive full price for a broken toy. So what is full price? That is whatever you would have paid for or traded the player away for before they got hurt. And so that brings us to the question of what's the discount. But before we could even get to that question, that's putting it a little bit ahead of the horse. Let's first of all look at the market for broken toys. The market for broken toys exists for three main reasons. The first one is, as I've mentioned earlier in the show, broken toys don't score points. So trading them for players who are scoring points helps teams that are contending and battling for playoff spots. The second reason is that dynasty managers have varying amounts of risk tolerance, which may lead them to be more willing to part with a broken toy because they want to manage their risk a little more than having that player on their roster. They'd rather take a surer bet in return and pass that risk off to another manager. And the third reason, and this is really more of an off-season reason, is something I would call recency bias. It makes some managers see the effects of the brokenness of their broken toy much more clearly than the performance before that. This is especially true if a player were injured early in the season, returned, and underperformed, particularly if it happened in a way that cost a manager a playoff game or a chance at a championship. Now, your sellers in this market primarily are going to be your contenders, particularly your win-now teams, which in our compass metaphor is the West. The West is for win-now. Those managers are looking for points in their lineups right now. Broken toys don't provide those. They're expendable. They can be traded away. But a broken toy could also come from a rebuilder, and this may seem counterintuitive because a rebuilder we would normally expect would be a buyer. However, a rebuilder might be willing to part with their broken toy in exchange for multiple assets, particularly draft picks, depending on where they are in the rebuilding process. And that's especially prominent if they also have a lower risk tolerance for the injured player that they have. They might be willing to take multiple shots at getting a cornerstone in the draft over trying to bank on this player returning. So your sellers are really looking for one of two things. They're looking for points now, or they're looking for value later. Now, your buyers are predominantly going to be the rebuilders, which I realize I just a moment ago said they were sellers, but they're often the buyers. They have the opportunity to pick up a star at a discount that would represent a strategic upgrade from an aging veteran that they have on their roster they could trade away, or a next man up or a dart throw they can push farther down their bench. The other principal buyer here is going to be perennially contending teams. Those would be the teams in the North in our compass metaphor. These are teams that have the assets in place to make their run for a championship now. This is simply adding an additional piece at a discount for future productivity. So your buyers, the South and the North, who shouldn't be buying a broken toy? Well, it's the West, the win-now teams. Broken toys don't help a win-now team at all, unless they return later in the season or for the fantasy playoffs. If we're talking an early enough trade, the injury is early enough in the season, there is a chance that player might be back for the playoffs. There is still the risk of performance loss. It's not the best strategic move for someone in the West, but it could be that kind of shot in the arm boost that you need at the very end of the season that gets you over the top. The other people that probably should not be buying broken toys are our wait and seers who are in the East in our compass metaphor, unless you're sure that broken toy fits into your long-term strategic plans. You know they're not going to help you this season. And if you are putting them into your roster and changing directions later, you might end up unloading them next season or during the offseason, potentially at a further discount because they didn't fit into your plans. So I've been talking about this discount, and you're thinking, well, what is the discount that we're talking about? Now, as with most transactions in Dynasty, value is a function of the managers involved, their motivations, their needs, their risk tolerances, and their strategic directions. But you can find discounts from several different kinds of sellers. Now, these are not specific managers in terms of strategy or in terms of what they're trying to do this season. This is really more about the mindset of the manager who has the broken toy on their bench or on their IR spot. And again, we're going to talk about three here. The first one is what I would call the motivated seller. This is a win now manager who needs a lineup boost right now, particularly closing in on the trade deadline. They are likely to offer you the biggest discount because they need to move this non-performing asset off of their roster and get a performing one back in return. If that's something you can do for them, there's a very good chance you can get that broken toy at quite a discount. The second one would be the risk-averse seller. I mentioned that concept a little bit earlier. These are managers who are operating in any strategic direction who would just simply like to push that risk off onto somebody else and not have that be on their bench. And then finally, the third discount offerer would be what I would like to call the scorned-lover seller. These are managers who are not happy that their toy broke while they were playing with it, especially if that toy happened to break in the fantasy playoffs or very late in the season and it cost them an opportunity to get to the playoffs. That is a irrational, it's an emotional, and we talked earlier in another show about managing emotionally versus strategically. It's an emotional reaction to a situation, but it is an opportunity to get that player to discount. If the scorned lover is angry enough or disappointed enough in that player, they might be willing to let them go to just get that memory off their bench. So finally, we're getting to the meat of this. What kind of discount should we be looking for? Of course, it's up to the individual managers who are making the deal, but here's what I would consider to be a general guideline to at least see if you are in the ballpark as you're negotiating one of these transactions. You should expect what I would call 1/2 of a performance level down for a cornerstone or a set and forget starter. So what is a 1/2 performance level? Well, if let's say a quarterback, let's say Joe Burrow, was operating as a high-end QB1, so he was in the top 3 or 4 quarterbacks in fantasy scoring before the injury, should be priced at around a lower end quarterback 1, so 9, 10, 11, 12. Or if they are an older player than an upper end QB2, which should be almost a full performance level down. If we're talking about a developing talent, so this would be a younger player for whom the injury has temporarily derailed their development process because they're not getting playing time. That's going to be between 3/4 and 1.5 levels down. And that may have to be assessed based on their fantasy draft capital if there's someone who has not played at all. If we were looking at acquiring J.J. McCarthy in the 2024 season, he was injured in training camp. He did not play at all in the 2024 season. So we don't have anything to assess his performance on, so we'd have to assess it on draft capital. I would say that discount's going to be closer to 3/4 of a level if they had a fantasy relevant offensive role prior to the injury, a full level if we have a very limited sample size of production, and more than that if they have never played at all. And when we're talking about draft capital instead of fantasy performance, a full level would be 1 round. If they were a round 1 pick, you would value them as a round 2 pick. When we get to next man up level of the bench, probably not someone you really need to be acquiring, but if you do, we're looking at a 2-level down discount for this type of a player. So someone who has been a wide receiver 4 in fantasy scoring should be viewed as a wide receiver 6. And dart throws should only be acquired off the waiver wire only for free. You could have them as an add-in for a trade for something else, but there isn't really any reason to take a risk on a player who, even at their full health, is probably not going to get into your starting lineup anyway. Now, if you can't get this discount, if you can't get any discount, but certainly if you can't get anything like what we're talking about here, then don't make the move. Don't trade the player. Don't trade for the broken toy if you can't get this discount. This season, 2025, Joe Burrow, Malik Neighbors, Tucker Kraft, they were all top 3 fantasy performers at their positions before they went down, and they may all come back at that level, but they may not. They may not next year or in year 2, and perhaps not ever. So anyone who is looking to sell them at a full price can keep them. It's a function and part of how much you believe they will return at 100% or better. Only you know what you believe. Only you know your risk tolerance. Only you know how to value the assets you're sending in return. But I think as a general rule, if you're not getting a discount, don't get the player. So as we talk about broken toys, risk comes into this quite a bit, and an understanding of what risk you are taking on if you want to bring a broken toy onto your roster. So there are a number of red flags that I would look at that either require a much steeper discount or I don't want any part of the broken toy in a transaction. One of those is how old are they? I don't mean to be ageist, but there is a reality that at certain ages, the recovery from injuries takes longer and it produces less production. So this would be 27 and older for running back, 29 and older for wide receiver and tight end, 32 and over at quarterback. Second red flag would be a history of soft tissue injuries or recurring injuries, especially if we're talking about concussions or repeated same limb injuries or hamstring injuries. Another red flag is their potential to lose their offensive role when they return. Perhaps their replacement has seized the role going forward. Who was the backup running back is now the RB1. Perhaps a RB1 who was injured, who was a 3-down back, has now lost that 3rd down role to someone else. In PPR formats, that 3rd down role can be particularly productive. And so an RB1 who loses that is no longer a fantasy RB1. They've lost some of that production opportunity. Maybe the offensive scheme has shifted. Instead of 3 wide receiver sets, the team is now playing more 12 and 13 personnel. With some of the injuries at wide receiver, the Los Angeles Rams have shifted suddenly very heavily into multiple tight end personnel sets, which is actually reducing the workload for players such as Puka Nacua. Now, Puka is not hurt right now, but if Puka were to become injured, become a broken toy and become available, there's a possibility that when he returns, he's not the one wide receiver that's out there on the field with the tight ends because he's not currently that wide receiver with the tight ends. And maybe even a new coaching staff or a new offensive coordinator shifts the relative importance or positions or roles, or maybe it's like Dan Campbell did this weekend in Detroit. The head coach just simply seizes control of the offensive play calling, and that changes up the roles of the players who are available. If we are talking about an injured player going back into that situation, their role may be quite different, even if there's no reduction in their ability to perform. The opportunity may change. Another red flag is going to be play styles that expose the players to more injuries. So a running back who seeks contact, someone like Cam Skattebo of the New York Giants, a quarterback who either doesn't slide when they run or the offensive scheme has them running a lot more than they probably should. That's someone like Jackson Dart. Sorry to keep picking on the Giants, but he's the example that comes to mind for me. He just is evaluated for a 4th time for concussion, counting the preseason and this season. If you have a wide receiver who likes to hurdle defenders, that means they get way up in the air. They could come down very hard. If they've had shoulder injuries in the past, it's a great way to re-aggravate those. So watch for player styles that could expose a player to more injuries. That would increase their re-injury rate. That would lower their value. As we move from productive starters to developing talents and to for more of a role player, if the offensive role was never more than potential or was never more than occasional sets, for whatever reasons they never developed into an offensive threat, you would be looking for some kind of a change in scheme or a change in scenery or a different team for that potential to develop. But at this point, it's just potential. Potential doesn't necessarily pan out. Even if they're at full health, they may not evolve into the kind of player you're looking for. Another red flag would be an injured player who is entering free agency while they are on the injured reserve list for the NFL. Risk-averse coaches and GMs in the real world may not want to take chances on this player. There's a potential that they would remain free agents once the season starts and perhaps hope to catch on somewhere, but that is further time that the player is theoretically healthy but is still not producing. And while there's hope that they would produce once they caught on, hope is not a strategy. So those are some things to be on the lookout for. Look for those red flags and make sure that you can get that discount before you acquire a broken toy, a player who's been previously productive but is on long-term IR. They can be important sources of value for your dynasty teams, but you have to acquire them at the discount. You cannot pay full price because the inherent risk of re-injury, the inherent risk of lower production and performance, the inherent risk of potentially being replaced and their role in the offense, all of those things mean that paying full price is paying too much. You probably will not get that value back. There's also something else to keep in mind, that while broken toys are indeed a terrific source of value for savvy dynasty managers, there are a lot more non-broken toys and sellers of them than there are broken toys and sellers of those. If there's a tight supply, the price may be up a little higher because of that, because there's few sellers, because there's little supply, to the point that the discount goes away out of scarcity. If that's the case, leave that broken toy on the bench that he's on. And as with any trade, a broken toy needs to fit your long-term strategy. I'll say it again. The biggest mistake dynasty managers make is making moves without having a strategy in place. Acquiring a broken toy with no strategy could leave you stuck holding, well, a broken toy that can't be fixed. Thank you so much for joining me today. That is our show on the island of broken toys. I hope it was a good visit to a nice vacation spot, and perhaps you will leave your vacation with more than a t-shirt. Perhaps you will leave with a newfound strategy or a refined strategy for acquiring broken toys for value onto your dynasty rosters. If you like the show today, please like, please subscribe, please review, please share on social media, share me with your friends. That's what I really love to be able to do, is be a guide to navigating these complex dynasty terrains using our compass metaphor and some of the strategies that have worked for me over the years, which I am trying to relay to you in hopes that it makes you a smarter, more winning dynasty manager. Next week, we're going to look at something that I call the strategic suck. I've talked about win now teams in great detail. These would be the lose now teams. Some of them are just bad teams, but some of them are bad for strategic reasons. They suck on purpose. So we are headed south and talking the end game for a lost season next week on Dynasty Compass.